So I'm going to start us off in the Newman packet and revisiting this section on globalization and social institutions to remind us that much of the focus in both Newman and Ritzer's textbook are on economics and economic globalization. This is partly due to the importance and primacy of economics the world over. There's the old adage of "it's the economy, stupid," which is a phrase that's been around for decades. But when analyzing social issues and social problems, a lot of it can be traced back to economics. And if you think about one of the primary motivations for all of us being here, it has to do with money. One of the reasons that people enroll in higher education is because they want the potential to increase their net lifetime earnings. Certainly one of the motivating factors for me being here is the paycheck I receive. I'm just thankful that I also enjoy my job. And so hopefully that's also something that you can do with your college degree, is find gainful employment that is satisfying to you in some regard. So, it's commonly said that money is the root of all evil. Perhaps it's greed that's the root of all evil. I'm not really sure. That's for a theological discussion, but certainly in many sociology textbooks, economics takes a central pivotal role. Now, this is also partly due to the fact that most contemporary sociologists align themselves much more with the conflict perspective than they do with the structural functionalist perspective. And this is important to realize because the conflict perspective has much of its roots in the works of Karl Marx, who focused exclusively on economic arrangements. Now, there are many types of conflict theorists out there, some who focus on gender, some who focus on race and ethnicity and nationality. But having its roots in the works of Karl Marx, economic arrangements and particularly capitalism are of central importance to many sociologists. And so even here, Newman is saying, so hence economic, political, and educational systems in modern society support the interests of those who control the wealth. See chapter 10. And then in chapter 9, right before chapter 10, when discussing globalization and social institutions, Newman discusses the social institutions of economics, education, religion in this sense, but not politics. And Ritzer also tends to avoid the direct discussion of politics. And it's sort of a mystery because economics is a central institution in societies all around the world and has a pivotal role in globalization, but so do politics. And the interesting difference between economics and politics are what they do or what the functions are for society. And you can locate this information way back in chapter 1 in the section on social institutions with the discussion of economy and politics and law, or the government. And so again, in your paper, I want you to select either the structural functionalist perspective or the conflict perspective. So the structural functionalist perspective is just going to focus on what the functions are of the economy or what the functions are of politics and the law. So there's manifest and latent functions, there are dysfunctions, but we're just looking at the structures and what they do and how it is that they might be disrupted if there are changes or something like that. But then the conflict perspective looks at these social institutions as sources of inequality. And so there are definitely different perspectives, and that will shape how you talk about these institutions. And so I want you to pick one or the other institutions as your primary focus. So you can focus on the economy in terms of the production and distribution of goods and services. And you can look at the economy in different types of societies. So Newman says in some societies, the economy is driven by the value of efficient production and the need to maximize profits. This was wrapped up in the discussion that I had on protectionism and Rivoli's study of t-shirts. And so Ritzer was talking about the consensus is that protectionism leads to less efficient economies, it leads to higher prices, and it generally doesn't work. And that where there are free markets and free trade in the t-shirt cycle, there tend to be lower prices of t-shirt and higher quality products. So Ritzer, who is an anti-capitalist, he is opposed to neoliberalism, even admits that the research and the consensus tend to point in that way. So those are more capitalist economies, ones driven by the value of efficient production and maximizing profits. And so multinational corporations are important aspects of the economy in that regard. And so in others, Newman says, the collective well-being of the population is the primary focus. So that would be more socialist or social democratic societies, such as like Scandinavian countries and historically the USSR, China, Cambodia, North Korea, North Vietnam, Venezuela, Cuba. And the focus there is on the collective well-being of the population with high taxes to fund a welfare state. Now, when discussing something like the welfare state and taxation, you necessarily have to bring government in because that's the only institution in society that has the power to withdraw taxes from individuals and organizations. So the function of the government or state or of politics and law is to essentially maintain order in society. Now, those who support the conflict perspective see this maintenance of the social order through government as the maintenance of the capitalist systems. And so this is the point of view that Ritzer takes throughout his book, is that the viewpoint of Lenin in terms of imperialism was to facilitate the spread of global or transnational capitalism. And Ritzer gets back to this in the Ritzer gets back to this in the last part of his chapter when he develops his ideas of neo-Marxian theories in much more detail. If you focus on politics and law or government exclusively, then the focus can be in one of democratic social orders where there is a more distributed network of power and authority throughout society and representation in government, as opposed to tyrannical or despotic governments that use authoritarian top-down rule to impose their will even at the resistance of the people. And again, I won't be surprised if the majority of students in the class choose the economy and economics as the primary focus, because those are in fact the two sources of discussion that are most prevalent in both Ritzer and Newman's books. So as I pointed out, when discussing globalization and social institutions, Newman first talks about economics, and he talks about multinational corporations at length, and again points out that in chapter 10, he's going to talk about this again. Chapter 10 was mentioned in the section on conflict theory when introducing Karl Marx. And so I've included chapter 10 in the book, or in this packet for you, as you can see here. And this is the section exclusively dealing with global development and inequality. Again, inequality is one of these topics that conflict theorists are much more equipped to address rather than structural functionalists, at least in terms of structural sources of inequality. And so these structural sources of inequality can be traced to global financial organizations like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, and these three organizations are discussed at length in Ritzer's book. And so along with those, financial organizations are multinational corporations. And so if we looked at the structural sources of inequality, what Newman and Ritzer are going to point at are multinational corporations and the World Bank, IMF, and World Trade Organization. And they both talk about these in terms of their role in the global capitalist order. And especially in chapter 9, we see Newman discuss this in terms of structural adjustment programs. And so this is one of the things that is brought back up in Ritzer's textbook, in which I've gone over before, in terms of some of the contradictions and some of the issues that we might start to see when we really start to kind of think about what are labeled free market capitalist systems and the role of these global bureaucratic structures that have the ability to impose their rules and systems of control, which are essentially interventions into the free market system. So again, these are two sources that you can draw from in the Newman packet. The focus today is, and for much of the remainder of the course, is on Ritzer's textbook. And so starting off here with a section of the book that we've seen before in chapter 3 is just kind of a reminder that Ritzer has this discussion of the development of the global capitalist system in the late 1800s. And this is the section in which he begins to cite classical liberal economists, Adam Smith and David Ricardo. And I've been over this material just a bit before, but I was just kind of reminding us that there are lengthy discussions of the development of the world system. And it's in this chapter where Ritzer is kind of developing this story about how the contemporary global capitalist order has come into development. Now, I think it would be a mistake to label that order a free market neoliberal system. So Ritzer definitely labels it a neoliberal system, but whether or not this is a free market system is something that could be debated in terms of the interventions that are committed by organizations that are part of what's called the Bretton Woods system. And so this is the section where discussions of the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, and the World Bank are first discussed. And so you'll want to look to these sections if you are going to choose those organizational structures, because they give you a much more lengthy discussion as compared to the Newman packet. And so again, I'm just kind of showing you where this information is located because there are some brief discussions on it in chapter 2 and brief discussions in the Newman packet, but Ritzer definitely has much more lengthy discussions. As well, in that same chapter, he brings up, again, another lengthy section on multinational corporations, which we will get back to in a future lecture. And then it's kind of an interesting section where he ends with a discussion of the myth of economic globalization. Because as you know from previous lectures, economic globalization is discussed as a fact, as a phenomenon that is an important factor shaping the world today. As you might have saw in Newman's section on economic globalization, he discusses economic globalization outright as more than just a matter of more goods being shipped from place to place. It's the fact that there are an increasingly interconnected set of cultural practices, political practices, of environmental problems and issues. And this is in concert with the fact that goods and services are often produced and distributed in various societies throughout the world and traded on a global market. One of the things that has brought this into awareness is the cargo ship that was blocking a major canal for global trade and essentially held up about 10% of the world's trade. So coming back to Ritzer's book, you know, he does give weight to different sides of arguments, but he at times does kind of come out and basically point out his view. So for example, in this section, he says, well, these are solid arguments. They really come down to the point that contemporary economic globalization may not be as new or as great as many contend. However, they do not contradict the idea that today's economy is globalized. The view adopted here, which means the view that Ritzer has, is that the economy is more global than Hurst and Thompson argue, and then has grown even more globalized since their argument was published decades ago. So Ritzer has a point of view in his book, and he again and again just comes out with this. And you can also see it in the sources that he cites, as well as the ideas that he privileges. And this is something that I think is a little bit more of a concern that you might have if you were aware of the other sides of the argument. And so this is kind of something that I've discussed in terms of how he addresses people like Adam Smith and David Ricardo. So again, coming back to the beginning of the semester when he's talking about the development of the current era of globalization. So he starts this chapter with a discussion of the global capitalist system, and he ends the chapter with basically his position that economic globalization is a major factor in the world and that it's very impactful and here to stay. And then he follows this chapter up with another chapter on economic globalization. So he's got 2 whole chapters on economic globalization. This is a very important idea to him. So again, I won't be surprised if in the term papers, a lot of students select the economy and economic globalization as their primary focus. Because there is scant discussion of political globalization throughout the book, though he does get to it in the last chapter of his book. So what I wanted to point out today from this chapter on global economic flows, where we've already discussed this brief section on t-shirts, where again, Ritzer is admitting that studies show that free trade produces the highest quality and cheapest t-shirts in the free markets where they exist, but that there are really very, very few free markets due to the protectionist and interventionist policies of nation states. But what I wanted to point out today in the section on trade is this idea that Ritzer does have a lengthy set of discussions on the nature of global trade. And so this is the section that I'm focusing on today. It's very short, pages 82 to 84. So he talks about trade in goods and services being clearly central to the global economy. And so this is basically central to any economy, the production and distribution of goods and services. That's basically how you would describe the economy as briefly as possible. So there's much more that goes into it. You can get multiple degrees in economics and be in discussions with other economists and have debates and that sort of thing like any academic would. So there's a lot of discussion to be had about any of this material, but the basic heart of the matter in economics is supply and demand, production and distribution of goods and services. So trade. So in terms of global trade, we have to think about some of the various chains and networks that are involved in the liquidity and the flows of these goods and services. And so he reminds us that he had those discussions in chapter 1. And remember that his use of these metaphors of liquids and flows are derived from the metaphors of Karl Marx that were later developed by a neo-Marxian scholar, Zygmunt Bauman. And so here he talks about the research of Gary Jurefy, who's outlined several of the most important economic chains and networks involved in global trade. The first of which, supply chains, get back to this idea that I was discussing in a previous lecture about the production of raw materials like cotton and how there are protectionist policies that subsidize the growth of cotton, that lower taxes on cotton producers, that essentially are paying cotton producers to produce their goods and make it easier for them to sell their goods on an open global market. And then other places around the world in Latin America, South America, throughout Asia, produce t-shirts or fabrics out of those raw materials. And so I showed a few videos in the playlist on the global network of supply chains producing t-shirts. And so with the focus on t-shirts, we have a raw material, cotton, we have an end product, t-shirts, and there are a lot of factors that are involved in that. So think about the production of automobiles that have complex machinery, computer chips, various types of raw materials from rubber to steel to aluminum to plastics to leather to the fabrics that are involved. Think about the technologies in your smartphones that use precious minerals that like cobalt that exist in very few places across the planet, as well as the technological sophistication involved in the cameras, the screens, the microchips, the memory cards, as well as their network into the GPS satellites that are interfaced around the world, and then the interface into the World Wide Web and the social media networks. So as you increase the complexity of the technology, there are necessarily more and more and more factors that are involved. So it's actually useful to focus in on sort of one small thing to think about the amount of people that are involved in producing something like t-shirts, where it's basically cotton and some ink or some some type of picture that is, embroidered into the t-shirt and then sold on an open market. So he talks about the fact that this necessarily involves networks of multinational corporations. Now, there's a helpful section in the Newman packet on this idea of networks of organizations. So organizational networks within institutions. So this is the idea going back to where I talk about how Disney and McDonald's and Coca-Cola are three multinational corporations, three of the largest multinational corporations that are networked together. So if you buy a Happy Meal around the time that there's a new Disney movie, oftentimes there'll be a new Disney toy in the Happy Meal. And the Happy Meal itself comes in a cardboard box that had to have a graphic designer and a producer and a distributor just of the cardboard box. And then there's the bread for the bun, or the breading for the chicken, or the production of the beef or the chicken, the apple and the plastic surrounding the apple. So all the component parts of a Happy Meal involve a series of networks that go beyond just McDonald's, Disney, and Coca-Cola. And so again, there are networks of organizations within institutions that facilitate the global trade of goods and services all around the world. And so that's what's being talked about in terms of international production networks. And so then we have global commodity chains. And this brings together the idea of value-adding chains in the global organization of industries. It also accords a central place to the growing importance of the sellers of global products. This includes buyer-driven chains such as Walmart, which play an increasing role in determining which industries produce and how much they produce. And so, this discussion of these global value chains is essential when we start thinking about global trade, because there are raw materials that are grown and extracted from the earth and produced all around the world. And then those raw materials are distributed to the places that can most efficiently produce usable commodities from those raw materials. And at every step of the chain, there's value added to the final product. And sometimes that final product is a 99-cent, strand of beads that is used one day at Mardi Gras. Sometimes the product is a smartphone that is used for a year or two before the user upgrades. Sometimes the product is an automobile or a watch, clothing, any type of food, or even eating utensils. So pretty much most of the things that are bought and sold on the global market have a series of steps that exist in terms of supply chains, production networks, commodity chains, and global value chains. And so when he talks about this idea of the global value chains, they say that emphasis on the relative value of those economic activities that are required to bring a good or service from conception to, through the different phase of production, delivery to final consumers, and final disposal after use. So I want to point this out because this idea of value is actually pretty tricky to deal with, and it's at the heart of the disagreements between the neoliberal and the neo-Marxian camps, this idea of value, where value comes from. When we're talking about the creation of value, like why do certain goods and products and services cost what they cost? Why is the price set where it's at? Well, part of it is involved in the objective price or cost of actually extracting raw materials from the earth, turning them into usable commodities, putting them on shipping containers that cost diesel fuel and the taxes and tariffs. And so there's a necessary level of cost that goes up with every incremental step of the way. But there's another side of that, which is the subjective consumer demand that involves individual people actually wanting or demanding some type of consumer item and their willingness to pay for it. And so these are all complex factors that go on in the organizational networks that carry out the functions of institutions like the economy that can produce the tax revenue for nation states to provide part of the funding for their organizational efforts. And so Ritzer has a discussion on this whole thing in this last paragraph, but that's what I want you to focus on in this section on global trade, economic chains and networks, is this idea that we have networks of organizations all involved in the production and distribution of goods and services the world around, and that every step of the way, there's some type of value being added to the products of the goods and services. But like I said, this is actually kind of a complex issue, because Karl Marx, who is the father of communism, from which many of the contemporary theories of socialism were developed, had a labor theory of value. So competing to that is the subjective theory of value. And I want to highlight this because I want to show the two essentially competing philosophies over why things cost what they cost. Why are prices set where they're at? And again, one of the goals for this course has been to show you that there are competing definitions of reality. There are competing worldviews, and I want to show you that you have options to choose from. So at the basic sense in this course, structural functionalism versus conflict theory. At a more refined level, neoliberalism versus neo-Marxian theories, and that their roots go back several decades and centuries to scholars like Adam Smith and David Ricardo and Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, who are the last two being favored by George Ritzer. And so here are two kind of essential ways to view the production of value in society.
Introducing the labor theory. The labor theory of value was a common theory in the 18th and 19th centuries about where prices come from, and how a thing's price is related to that thing's value. What exactly is a thing's price? Or to put it another way, what is a good or service really worth? What is its real value? A modern economist would answer that the value of a good or service is determined subjectively. To put it very simply, the value of the thing that's being traded just is whatever the people doing the trading can both agree upon within an exchange that each of them would prefer. You might say that there is no such thing as the real value, if you mean a value that's somehow independent of the bargain that the traders actually make. But for a long time, economists generally thought of the value of a good or service as something objective, that is, something about the object itself that's being traded. On this view, there is some basic bearer of value in the world, and all other values and prices can be counted as multiples of that basic unit of real value. Historically, the most significant version of this theory is that the basic bearer of value is human labor, measured in the hours of work that have to be given up in order to produce some good or service. That is the labor theory of value. Adam Smith summed up the labor theory this way: the real price of everything, what everything really costs to the man who wants to acquire it, is the toil and trouble of acquiring it. That toil and trouble includes the labor necessary to sustain oneself, as well as to replenish any materials used and to cover the costs of wear and tear on any tools or machines. But in order to improve one's standard of living over time, there must also be extra labor to create a surplus, like the tools and materials needed to build a new, bigger house, as well as enough food to last on the days spent building. So when two people exchange, the price the consumer pays to the producer is just equal to the amount of labor time that is required to produce the commodity. Now, that doesn't mean the producer can just increase the value by working more slowly. The value doesn't depend on how much time the production actually takes, but on how much time it generally takes, given the level of productivity that's possible in society at the time. The price is equal to the value of the labor that is socially necessary to provide the producer's subsistence, to replace the spent capital, and to secure a surplus. It's important to see that on this theory, everything on the production side is labor. This is easy enough to see in the case of the living, breathing work that goes into production. But even the capital that makes the work possible can be seen as a kind of reified labor. Karl Marx sometimes described capital as accumulated labor because it is the result of labor done in the past, and it has become embodied, so to speak, in the form of tools and machines and factories, in the form of materials, and in the form of savings. These things are often called the means of production, or just capital. Neither work nor capital produce anything without the other. It always takes these two factors, these two types of labor, to produce anything. The labor theory of value is a theory about the nature of prices. It says that the real price of any good or service depends on some feature of that good or service. In particular, its real price depends on the quantity of all the labor that is socially necessary as an input to the production of that good or service. Very simply put, prices count the hours of work required.
Okay, so if you believe in the labor theory of value, then you think that if there's any type of extra value that is produced, if you believe in that, then you believe that any type of extra value that is produced beyond what the object that is produced costs. So if it's a t-shirt or a phone, the labor theory of value says there's an objective price that follows, and anything more than that price is exploiting the labor. So this is where the conflict theorists and the Marxians get their idea of exploitation in the economy, is because they believe that there's an objective value of commodities built into the price of labor, and that anything more than that, that capitalists or the bourgeoisie take, is exploiting the workers. But this rests upon the labor theory of value. And so there are other competing theories of value, and one of them, and the directly opposing theory is the subjective theory of value.
One of the most crucial insights of economics is that value is subjective. It means value ultimately comes from the human mind. It doesn't inhere in the things that we value. And I want to explain that with some t-shirts that I went out and made. I went to the mall recently and bought 2 t-shirts, and I bought some iron-ons. And here's one of my t-shirts. It's of a revolutionary who's famous from Cuba, Che Guevara. And another t-shirt of one of my heroes, Milton Friedman. Now these t-shirts both cost me about the same amount of time to make, same amount of money. So in terms of what I spent, the resources that went into these t-shirts, it's the same. But you know what? The value of the Che t-shirt is in fact a lot higher to most people than is the value of the Milton Friedman t-shirt. If for some reason Che falls out of favor in the public mind, the value of the Che t-shirt falls. If the value of Milton Friedman's image rises, if people come to really like Milton Friedman, the value of the Friedman t-shirt increases. But the point is, objectively, physically, these t-shirts, this one and this one, are largely identical. The only difference is the image on the front. This is a nice thing about subjective value. Our values do differ. I would not be caught on the street wearing a Che t-shirt because I think he was a scoundrel, right? I would love to wear a Milton Friedman t-shirt. In fact, I'm eager to wear this for the first time. I value this t-shirt more highly than do other people. And that's one of the beautiful things about understanding subjective value. It's important to understand that the value is not in the thing itself. It doesn't come, like the Marxists believed, or even the classical economists believe, from the amount of labor that goes into producing it. Value is not a product of how many other resources went into producing something. Ultimately, things have value only if and only because human beings want those things. The more intensely human beings want those things, the more valuable they are. The classical economists, for all their wonderful discoveries, did not get subjective value. Economists didn't understand subjective value until the middle of the 19th century, when particularly Karl Menger of the Austrian school realized that people pay for things only because they want those things. They don't pay for things that they don't want. And so the value that people have in their minds for the things they buy, that value gets transmitted through money prices into the market prices of the goods and services. One implication of subjective value is that you can't tell me that the fact that I prefer the Milton Friedman t-shirt to the Che Guevara t-shirt means that I'm wrong. It's not your preference, perhaps, but it's my preference. And because you can't read my mind and I can't read your mind, the best you can do is say, well, if I prefer the Friedman t-shirt to the Guevara t-shirt, then in fact, the Friedman t-shirt to me is more valuable. If you prefer the Guevara t-shirt to the Friedman t-shirt, then the best I can conclude is that the Guevara t-shirt to you is more valuable than the Friedman t-shirt. Neither of us are right or wrong in some objective sense. Subjective value is just what each of us, how each of us assesses the worth to each of us of each of these t-shirts. That's one of the things that make the economic world go round. We have these different valuations of different things. We express our valuations and how much we're willing to pay.
So the subjective theory of value is completely different than the labor theory of value, because the subjective theory of
Introduce.
because the subjective value of theory says that, I said that wrong. The subjective theory of value says that value is inherently what is conceived of or perceived or interpreted in the mind of the consumer. And so if a t-shirt goes to market and it's priced at $20, it might go down to $2 after a period of time if it's not selling, because the sellers just are not selling it at the higher price because people don't see a value in that t-shirt. And again, these are two competing theories of how the economy is founded, what the economy is founded on. You have the Marxian theory based upon the labor theory of value, and that's discussed at length. And then you have more of the neoliberal theories, which depend upon the subjective theory of value and the prices reflecting demand for the supply that's available. So if you look up subjective value, you'll find many different debates and points of view. So in the second video down, you can see that somebody is directly countering the person that we just saw. The point being made here was the difference between Che Guevara shirts and Milton Friedman shirts. Just today, I saw a post by Counterpunch promoting the image of Che Guevara and the efficiency of socialist Cuba producing COVID-19 vaccines, because in their assessment, the capitalist profit motive does not function to produce public goods and services. And so you do have these two competing visions. And again, I think that, it would benefit you to some degree to look at the different ideas that are around on the competition between where value comes from, because it really does kind of set the foundation for how it is that we're going to understand something like global trade and global value chains and commodity chains. And this really is at the heart of George Ritzer's discussion of neoliberalism. And so what Ritzer is doing is he's using opponents of neoliberalism like David Harvey and Naomi Klein to define and discuss it. And when he does, he discusses people like Milton Friedman, who the previous speaker would prefer on his t-shirt. Milton Friedman was an economics professor at the University of Chicago, and he had a profound impact on economic thought, primarily through a book like Capitalism and Freedom. George Ritzer very much prefers people like Naomi Klein, whose influential book, The Shock Doctrine, has convinced people, for example, that Milton Friedman's Chicago economics and the Chicago Boys worked with the IMF and World Bank to institute structural adjustments, and that this Washington consensus helped to spread the thoughts of neoliberalism. In fact, Ritzer says much of the world came to accept or was coerced into accepting neoliberalism. This idea of coercion, though, is anathema. It's in opposition to Milton Friedman's thoughts, because Friedman was a person who championed freedom. And so coercion is the opposite of freedom. It's forcing somebody to do something. And in fact, Milton Friedman did not support the IMF, as Ritzer is pointing out here. So these are kind of points of contention that I bring up, because it's important when we go on to understand some of the basic ideas of neoliberalism that Ritzer wants to point out. So Ritzer points out that it's based on free markets and deregulation. But if you have calls for deregulation, that means there are regulations, and there is thus no thing as a free market. And so when Ritzer is discussing the global capitalist system, you have to keep in mind that it's a global capitalist system full of protectionist regulatory policies that intervene into the free market, which is defined as a market free of any impediments. And so this gets to how the state functions in a neoliberal economy, and that in democratic political systems where there's more freedom, there is more freedom to associate and buy and sell and trade and engage in entrepreneurship. The proponents of neoliberal policies want lower taxes so that they can incentivize corporations to locate themselves in places where they suffer lower costs to production, because a tax or a tariff necessarily increases the cost of production and distribution of goods and services. And so this necessarily minimizes the welfare state and safety nets for the poor, which is a point of contention if, like Newman points out, there are economies that are focused on the well-being of the whole. And so in the neoliberal state, there's a focus on the limited government, because the theory is that a free market based upon supply and demand, which assumes that consumer demand and subjective value guide the production of goods and services, is a more efficient and more productive system than a government guided system, especially those of centrally planned economies like socialist economies. And I have a video in here if you want to know what socialism is, as well as Karl Marx's theories that eventually led to modern conceptions of socialism. I have several videos for you to explore in the playlist. And so these are important ideas to think about in terms of, you know, how it is that we understand the global economy. And so when we're looking at Ritzer's discussion of the neoliberal state, he's doing so from a neo-Marxian position. So he is not in favor of limited government or individual liberty or free trade or free markets. And so, you know, he has statements like the neoliberal state also works to reduce barriers to the free movement of capital across national borders and the creation of new global markets. This would be a theory of neoliberalism, but he is in favor of the work of people like David Harvey, who argues that neoliberalism has not made the state or particular institutions of the state irrelevant. Rather, the institutions and practices of the state have been transformed to better attune themselves to the needs and interests of neoliberal market and the economy. Ritzer is not saying here that he's in favor of this. He's saying that, like he did in the section on imperialism, that it's global capitalism that is dominating the state. And in fact, what the state is in need to control the free market. And we know that this is Ritzer's point of view because when he introduces a critique of neoliberalism through Karl Polanyi, he says that Polanyi shows that the laissez-faire system came into existence with the help of the state, and it was able to continue to function as a result of state actions. And that furthermore, if the laissez-faire system was left to itself, it threatened to destroy society. So this is sort of a contradiction in terms, because a laissez-faire system is a free market system, but if it could only exist with a state intervening, then it's not actually a free market system. But they call this the double movement. And so this is one of those kind of contradictions that neo-Marxians are comfortable dealing with the idea that there is a coexistence of contradicting systems like the laissez-faire market and the reaction against it to the state or by the state. And so Ritzer has a lot of discussion on these ideas, and he is definitely on the side of Karl Polanyi, who is assumed as thinking that the nation states are developing economic systems that lay down the law to society and to the primacy of society over that system. And so meaning that the state and society should dominate the economy, that they should control or regulate the economy. So Ritzer says this promise to end the evils produced by the dominance of the free market system, and also to produce more rather than less freedom. So Ritzer believes that the free market system is producing evils that threaten to destroy society, and that actually if there is more regulation of the economy, there will be more freedom. So these are ideas he's deriving from Karl Polanyi. And he says that Polanyi's hope lay with society and the nation state, but they have been rendered far less powerful with the rise of globalization, especially the global economy. So here we can see Ritzer definitely taking the side of Polanyi, and then he offers contemporary criticisms that rest in the works of David Harvey and Naomi Klein. And so what I would like to do with the remaining time is to show you the other side of the story. And so these are a few short videos from the mouth of Milton Friedman himself, so that you can get a better sense of what Milton Friedman actually argued in terms of his ideas about the functions and operations of the free market system.
The view I'm expressing is a view that classically has been termed liberalism. In the modern day and age, the word liberal has come to mean almost the opposite of what it used to mean. If you look at the dictionary, liberal means of and pertaining to freedom. If you look at behavior today, liberal means of and pertaining to freedom with other people's money. I am a liberal in the original sense, in the sense in which John Stuart Mill was a liberal, in the sense of which his statement was a statement of liberalism. And the liberal view that the justification for government action is to prevent coercion and to promote voluntary cooperation among responsible individuals leads to a very short list of basic functions which government should undertake. They are first.
So right there, he's expressing the idea of limited government, and he's opposed to coercion. Ritzer says that people like Milton Friedman were actually involved in coercing populations to undertake their views and values. So these two statements cannot exist logically together. Either Milton Friedman is not telling the truth, or Ritzer is not telling the truth.
First of all, to prevent one man from coercing another, the internal police function. There are second, providing for external defense. These two are really part of the same, to prevent coercion from within, to prevent coercion from without. And beyond this, to promote voluntary cooperation among people by defining the terms under which we're going to cooperate together and by adjudicating disputes. If we are going to cooperate with one another in a voluntary way, we have to know what the rules of this game we're playing are. What are the terms? What rights do I have? What rights do you have? The basic principles underlying the free market, as Adam Smith taught them to his students in this university, are really very simple.
Look at this lead pencil. There's not a single person in the world who could make this pencil. Remarkable statement? Not at all. The wood from which it's made, for all I know, comes from a tree that was cut down in the state of Washington. To cut down that tree, it took a saw. To make the saw, it took steel. To make the steel, it took iron ore. This black center, we call it lead, but it's really graphite, compressed graphite. I'm not sure where it comes from, but I think it comes from some mines in South America. This red top up here, the eraser, bit of rubber, probably comes from Malaya, where the rubber tree isn't even native. It was imported from South America by some businessmen with the help of the British government. This brass ferrule, I haven't the slightest idea where it came from, or the yellow paint, or the paint that made the black lines, or the glue that holds it together. Literally thousands of people cooperated to make this pencil. People who don't speak the same language, who practice different religions, who might hate one another if they ever met. When you go down to the store and buy this pencil, you are in effect trading a few minutes of your time for a few seconds of the time of all those thousands of people. What brought them together and induced them to cooperate to make this pencil? There was no commissar sending out orders from some central office. It was the magic of the price system, the impersonal operation of prices that brought them together and got them to cooperate to make this pencil so that you could have it for a trifling sum. That is why the operation of the free market is so essential, not only to promote productive efficiency, but even more, to foster harmony and peace among the peoples of the world.
So going back to Ritzer's criticisms, when he talks about these ideas of the free market system, he places great emphasis on critics like Karl Polanyi. And so Ritzer says of Polanyi's book, The Great Transformation, that Polanyi is the great critic of a limited focus on the economy, especially the focus of economic liberalism on the self-regulating or unregulated free market, as well as on basing all on self-interest. You can see that Milton Friedman is the exact opposite, that in fact, he calls it the magic of the free market system. And this quote unquote magic is the pricing system. And that the pricing system doesn't come out of a labor theory of value, but what people are willing to purchase at what cost to them in terms of monetary value. And that through this production of goods and services on the global trade networks, thousands of people who don't know each other, don't speak the same languages, don't have the same governments or probably even religions, all cooperate to produce goods and services that are traded among people of the world. So these are two competing visions of the global economy. You have the neoliberal vision and you have the neo-Marxian vision. And so the neo-Marxian vision blames transnational capitalism and neoliberalism for the world's problems, whereas the proponents of free market systems and neoliberalism see it as the pathway to peace and prosperity and liberty. And so I will pick up from there with a more direct discussion of neo-Marxian theories in the following lecture and move on with material including political globalization.